I was halfway up the ladder, roller dripping white paint onto my driveway, when the stranger with the clipboard marched up like she was leading an army. Her sunglasses were the sort worn by people who shout at minimum-wage employees. I didn't know her name yet, but I would learn it soon. Everyone did. She introduced herself with a smile so tight it threatened to implode her skull and told me I had 24 hours to repaint my home to community-approved colors, or be fined. My first mistake was laughing. My second was assuming she was joking. I told her I wasn't part of the HOA because I wasn't. My house sat technically outside the boundary line by 12 glorious feet. She insisted my property visually affected the neighborhood's beauty and therefore still had to comply. When I told her that wasn't how land ownership worked, she scribbled furious notes, glared like an offended peacock, and stomped away promising an official response. I shrugged it off, but a part of me already knew. This woman was going to make herself the villain of my month. The next day I received a letter taped aggressively to my mailbox, scrawled in cursive that looked like someone angry writing wedding invitations. It threatened escalating fines and legal action if I continued painting an unauthorized color. I called the number at the bottom. A bored-sounding man picked up and confirmed it was a legitimate notice from the HOA. Then I repeated the magic phrase, "I am not in your HOA." His silence stretched on for so long I wondered if he'd died. Finally, he muttered something about, "The president will handle this personally." When I asked who their president was, he whispered the name like a curse, Karen. A moment later, he hung up. I really shouldn't have laughed so hard. By Saturday morning, Karen was back with reinforcements, 2 volunteer board members wearing matching polos and smugness. They pointed at paint cans, snapped photos, demanded proof of my property lines. I walked them to the back fence and showed them the survey stakes. They frowned. Karen insisted the survey was clearly wrong and waved an old HOA handout showing a map that looked like a kindergarten treasure drawing. She claimed the boundary line must have shifted. When I asked how property boundaries shift, she said something about evolving community identity. That was the moment I knew she'd invented her own legal system. I told her no one was moving my fence except a licensed professional with a court order. She squinted like she was trying to set me on fire with the power of her mind and left without another word. Later that afternoon, while I was taking a break inside, I heard unfamiliar voices out front. When I opened the door, Karen and her goons were measuring my house with bright orange tape. They looked like surveyors except with the confidence of people who have no idea what they're doing. She dramatically announced that my house was visible from the public street and therefore subject to aesthetic standard. I politely reminded her that laws don't work like playground rules. She countered with a speech about neighborhood harmony, property values, and preserving the dream community experience. The woman had a gift for delivering nonsense as if reciting scripture. I asked what dream community she was talking about. Her supporters gasped as if I'd insulted a sacred temple. That night, I found a new letter. This time the fine had doubled, and now I was also in violation of a rule about unauthorized ladder placement during visible hours. I read it twice, trying to understand how a ladder could be unauthorized. It stood on my concrete, touching only my wall. I considered ignoring them, but instead I took photos of all the letters, recorded a time-stamped video showing my fence line, and emailed everything to my lawyer cousin. His response was one sentence: "This lady is begging to be sued." The idea of counterattacking hadn't crossed my mind yet, but the seed was planted. On Monday, Karen returned alone. Her face strained under the pressure of her smile, like holding back actual flames. She asked if we could chat, neighbor to neighbor. She told me she'd worked hard to build this community into a showcase, that people moved here for a certain lifestyle, and my non-conforming white walls would downgrade the environment. She explained that she wasn't doing this for power but out of responsibility to uphold the standards everyone agreed to. Everyone except me, of course. I pointed that out. Her eye twitched. She told me that some people need to be guided for their own good. She took a step closer, lowered her voice, and said, "A house that refuses to blend in becomes the enemy of the neighborhood." I realized then that this wasn't about paint. It was about control. When she left, she made a promise. She said if I insisted on being a problem, the HOA would treat me like one. That sentence lingered longer than I'd admit. I tried to distract myself by focusing on my renovation plans. The house was a fixer-upper I'd inherited from my aunt. My goal was simple: restore it, live quietly, enjoy breathing room. I'd chosen the area specifically because there was no HOA on my deed. But Karen did not care what paperwork said. She cared only about the imaginary crown she believed she wore. I pictured her at home polishing it while drafting new commandments. The escalation came faster than expected. The next morning, I walked outside to find red stickers slapped across my front windows reading, "Notice of Violation." I ripped them down and spotted security cameras pointed at my property from across the street. That evening, someone placed 3 giant swatches of beige, tan, and grayish on my porch with paint codes labeled "Approved Selections." There was also a note saying the HOA had scheduled repainting of my home at my expense if I didn't comply by Friday. I laughed again, though it sounded different this time. Less amused. More like the calm before a storm begins to enjoy itself. They had crossed the line separating annoying neighbors from actual harassment. So I did what any rational person would do when confronted by unreasonable authority. I began gathering every piece of documentation that proved my independence from them. Deed copies, boundary maps, county records. I even contacted the original developer, who confirmed my lot had always been exempt. Meanwhile, Karen strutted around the neighborhood like a queen convinced the execution was already scheduled. She waved to me with triumphant pity whenever she passed, like she expected to see my spirit cracking in real time. What she didn't know was that I had just discovered my greatest advantage. Her HOA rules, threats, and fines held no legal power over me. 0. All she had accomplished so far was providing a mountain of evidence that she and her board were harassing a private homeowner. And the more she pushed, the worse it would get for her. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to panic. I was simply going to wait. Because Karen had made one critical mistake. She picked a fight with someone who had all the time in the world to win. Revenge isn't a single action. It's a strategy. A long game. And while Karen was busy sprinting toward whatever imaginary finish line she believed existed, I was already laying my own track. First step, information. I needed to understand exactly what kind of monster I was dealing with. So I asked around. Every conversation with neighbors started with normal chit-chat and ended with the same terrified whisper, "She will ruin your life if you oppose her." Someone told me Karen once forced a retired veteran to replace his mailbox because she didn't like the shade of metal. Another said she shut down a family's backyard treehouse because it cast a shadow on her lawn. The crown jewel of her tyranny was forcing a couple to relocate a swing set because the laughter of children was disruptive to the neighborhood's tranquility. Each tale came with the same resigned shrug. That's just Karen. But I am many things, including allergic to bullies. Meanwhile, the HOA's letters evolved from threats to declarations of war. One said I was accruing daily penalties. Another warned they would place a lien on my property. When I called their office again, the same poor man answered, and when I reminded him I wasn't in their HOA, he actually sighed and said, "She told us not to listen to you." I asked him whether Karen was attempting to annex my home like a dictator in a poorly planned coup. He didn't laugh. I hung up, feeling strangely energized. If Karen thought she owned the law, I needed to show her what real authority looked like. I drove to the county zoning office and explained the issue. The clerk, a woman with the demeanor of someone who had seen every flavor of ridiculous, listened carefully. Then she asked for the HOA's name. The moment I said, "Karen," she rolled her eyes so dramatically I thought they'd get stuck. She knew exactly who I meant. Apparently, Karen filed complaints frequently. Loudly. aggressively, and always without merit. The clerk printed copies of my parcel information, reassured me my property was not subject to any HOA oversight, and said that if they continued, the county might get involved. I thanked her, walked outside feeling triumphant, and immediately received a text from an unknown number. "You're wasting your time. The community supports me." It was signed with the letter K. Subtlety was not her strength. That weekend, my cousin, who had been following my updates with popcorn-level enthusiasm, drove over. He recommended we respond not with a defensive stance, but a legal offensive. A cease and desist letter. Harassment documentation. Possibly invasion of privacy. Maybe even a restraining order if things escalated. I liked the sound of that. We drafted a beautiful letter, one that danced elegantly between legal jargon and my personal favorite form of communication, sarcasm. We printed it on crisp paper and mailed copies to Karen and every member of her board. 3 days later, the real escalation began. I woke up to find a group of strangers staring at my house like appraisers at a cattle auction. They wore matching contractor shirts. Trucks with ladders lined the curb. I stepped outside and one man hurried over, clipboard in hand. He informed me they were hired by the HOA to repaint my home. Today. I asked who gave that instruction. He pointed to Karen, who stood across the street like a general, arms folded, basking in imaginary glory. I informed the contractor that anyone who touched my property without permission would be trespassing. The man looked uncomfortable, apologized, and retreated. Karen stomped toward me, her shoes clicking like boots of righteousness, and demanded I move aside. She accused me of interfering with an authorized project. I asked who authorized it. She puffed up and declared she did. When I asked if she held any legal authority over me, she cackled, a theatrical, villain-grade sound that made her own supporters look uneasy. I calmly told her that if her workers so much as opened a paint can near my wall, I would call the sheriff. She told me I was bluffing. I pulled out my phone and dialed. She watched, stunned, as I actually made the call. Deputies arrived in record time because, as one of them later admitted, Karen called the cops so often that they practically waited around for her next tantrum. I explained the situation. Karen jumped in, insisting she had documents proving jurisdiction. She thrust her kindergarten map at the deputy, who stared at it like he'd been handed a child's drawing of a dinosaur. He asked for actual contract, deed, anything legal. Karen said she didn't need them because everyone knew the rules. The officer looked at me with a face that said, "I'm sorry for what you're going through," and ordered her crew to leave. Karen screeched that this wasn't over. The deputy told her to lower her volume before he considered disorderly conduct. I loved that man. Later, after the police left, the neighborhood buzzed. People peeked through blinds. A few approached privately, thanking me. One older gentleman confessed he'd once tried to oppose Karen's rules, and she slapped him with so many fines he gave up. Hearing that changed something in me. This wasn't just my fight anymore. I wasn't just defending paint. I was standing against a tyrant in pastel sweaters. But Karen wasn't retreating. The next morning at dawn, alarms blared from across the street. She marched toward my property with a binder thicker than a Bible. She waved it like proof of divine law and warned that she would escalate this to the highest community court. I asked whether she meant a real legal entity or the imaginary tribunal in her head. She ignored the question and accused me of breaking additional rules. Unapproved mailbox color, excessive lawn height, unauthorized shrubbery growth. None of which applied to me, but she was clearly spiraling. I noticed her board members were missing today. Her army had shrunk to one woman gripping paperwork like a security blanket. That evening, new signs appeared around the neighborhood. They had pictures of my house with giant red X's and the words community risk printed underneath. I removed them from my yard and snapped more photos for the harassment file. Karen lurked nearby, arms crossed, like a vigilante who thought she was protecting civilization from the horror of white paint. I asked her if she really believed I might cause some form of architectural apocalypse. She hissed that non-compliance leads to chaos. I asked if chaos meant kids painting hopscotch on sidewalks. She didn't answer. Maybe she feared chalk. Then she used her last card, public shaming. She scheduled a mandatory HOA meeting, mandatory for HOA members, mind you, and invited everyone to attend so she could address the dangerous homeowner threatening our peaceful community. Multiple neighbors tipped me off. One sent me a picture of the flyer. It described me as a disruptor and claimed I was lowering property values. That amused me most. My house was in better shape than half the neighborhood, thanks to the renovation progress she kept interrupting. I didn't attend the meeting. I didn't need to. Reports came in almost immediately. Karen ranted for half an hour about my crimes. When someone asked why she cared about someone not in the HOA, she snapped that leadership must sometimes act beyond rules for the greater good. That statement apparently caused an uproar. People pushed back. Loudly. They were tired of her terrorizing everyone. When the meeting adjourned, someone texted me that Karen left furious, promising to finish this once and for all. I stared out my window at my freshly painted white walls glowing in the sunset. I wasn't scared. I wasn't angry. I was patient, because this was no longer a paint dispute. Karen had declared war on reality itself, and reality was on my side. I knew Karen wasn't finished. People like her don't accept defeat. They reshape the world in their head until they're the hero again, no matter how many laws or common sense get trampled along the way. My lawyer cousin told me to prepare for something dramatic, something stupid, and probably something illegal. He wasn't wrong. 2 days of eerie silence passed. No letters. No stickers. No construction crews measuring my roof pitch like archaeologists. For a moment, I thought maybe her own board had finally restrained her. Maybe the meeting had pulled the curtain back too far. But a person that committed to a delusion doesn't just abandon it. The storm was loading. She was recalculating. The third morning, I woke to the screech of metal grinding against pavement. I rushed outside barefoot, coffee in hand. A utility truck sat in front of my house, a worker halfway up a pole with bolt cutters aimed directly at my power line. I asked what he thought he was doing. He told me the HOA had reported my home as an unauthorized residence draining community resources. I told him the HOA didn't control utilities. He said they'd sent paperwork. I demanded to see it. The document was a comically fake authorization letter stamped with a logo that looked like someone traced a badge from a children's coloring book. The signature was Karen's very recognizable, furious cursive. I pointed out the absurdity, but the worker explained that his job was to follow instructions from whoever filed the complaint until told otherwise. Bureaucracy at its finest. 2 institutions arguing while my lights were seconds from disappearing. I called the power company directly, gave my account information, and confirmed in real time that everything was paid and legitimate. The worker froze, hands still clutching the cutter. He apologized, climbed down, and drove off quickly like he feared Karen might chase him with a pitchfork. I turned around and there she was, standing across the street, smiling the way wolves would if wolves had HOA badges. She asked me if I enjoyed my lucky break. I told her luck had nothing to do with it, just the law she kept pretending didn't exist. She insisted the law was evolving. I asked if evolution usually goes backward. She didn't get the joke. Within an hour, another truck arrived. This time, a landscaping crew ready to correct non-compliant vegetation. They had chainsaws. They were eyeing my shrubs like they were about to liberate them from tyranny. I forbid them from entering my yard and told them the HOA had 0 rights on my property. The crew chief didn't want trouble, so he left. Karen yelled after them about community duty and cowardice. They ignored her. I documented everything. Videos, timestamps, saved emails. My cousin said we were building the kind of case lawyers bragged about decades later. The only wild card was that unpredictable variable named Karen. That afternoon, she escalated. Again. I saw her striding toward my house with another official-looking man. His car had government plates. A county inspector. I almost thanked her. Finally, someone who understood actual rules. He introduced himself politely and asked to view the renovations for safety compliance. I allowed it. He walked through each room, checked wiring, structural changes, foundation updates. Everything passed. The man complimented my craftsmanship. Karen's smile cracked like porcelain meeting a hammer. Then the inspector pulled out his paperwork and explained that the anonymous complaint he received accused me of building a fortress intended to intimidate residents. A fortress? Me. A man painting walls white. Karen tried to interject, but the inspector shut her down instantly. He warned her that filing false violations is a punishable offense. He told her he would be reporting this incident to the county board. Karen's fury detonated silently. Her face didn't go red, it went cold. She thanked the inspector through gritted teeth and marched away, shoulders stiff, rage bottled but boiling. She had lost face. And for someone who survives on power, humiliation is oxygen deprivation. By evening, the whole neighborhood knew the story. Kids rode bikes up and down the street whispering my name like I was a mythical character. Grown adults strolled by pretending to walk dogs they didn't own, just to give me discreet thumbs up. The legend of the man who rejected the mighty HOA spread faster than gossip at a family reunion. I might have enjoyed it too much. So when someone knocked gently on my door, I half expected a fan asking for an autograph. Instead, it was Mrs. Benson, a sweet elderly woman from the cul-de-sac. She nervously apologized for bothering me and confessed something shocking. She told me Karen had convinced the HOA board to attempt an emergency annexation. Their plan was to vote on absorbing my property into the HOA. They thought if they controlled the vote, they controlled me. It was delusion elevated to strategy. Mrs. Benson said the vote was happening tomorrow at noon. She urged me to show up with proof that I wasn't included. She looked frightened, like she expected Karen to appear behind her at any moment. I thanked her and promised I'd be prepared. The next morning, I put on my nicest shirt, tucked my documents under my arm, and arrived early. The meeting was held in the Community Recreation Center, a room decorated like a toddler's dentist office, pastel walls and motivational posters about belonging. Karen stood at the head of the table like she was presiding over Congress. Board members avoided eye contact, clearly battling the second-hand embarrassment of being associated with her. She announced the sole agenda item: a vote regarding the assimilation of the non-compliant property into the community governance structure. She said it with the confidence of someone who believed she had already won. I raised my hand. She ignored me. I raised it again. She glared like I'd interrupted a royal decree and finally acknowledged me with a dismissive wave. I presented my deed, survey, and county records. I quoted the exact development agreement that exempted my parcel. The board studied the papers. The room murmured. Karen insisted the documents were misleading. I told her facts don't care about her aesthetics. She accused me of being disrespectful. I said respect had to be earned. The board members tried desperately to avoid smiling. Someone called for a vote. It was unanimous. Against Karen. They refused to annex my property. They declared the issue closed permanently. Karen was stunned into silence. For 5 terrifying seconds, I thought she might implode and take the entire room with her. Then she whispered the words that revealed her true breaking point. "If I can't control you, you don't belong here." She stormed out, leaving her board staring after her. And for the first time, I saw fear in their eyes, not of me, but of the tyrant they had just defied. The long game was working. Now she was desperate. And desperation creates chaos. What I didn't know yet was that Karen had one final move planned. A move that involved crossing a line no one could come back from. Trouble was only just beginning. I expected Karen to recover by launching another ridiculous campaign about shrub height or mailbox font. Instead, she disappeared for a day. A single day. That should have been a relief, but silence from Karen was like silence from a toddler with a marker. Something bad was happening out of view. My cousin warned me to be vigilant. He said people like her don't retreat, they reload. I agreed. I installed new cameras, checked locks twice, and tried to act calm even though adrenaline now lived in my blood. The next morning, I opened my door and stepped into a crime scene composed entirely of paper. Hundreds of flyers littered my lawn, each printed with a picture of my house cropped at an unflattering angle and words accusing me of endangering community safety. It claimed my renovations involved hazardous chemicals, illegal electrical wiring, and a secret underground bunker. The last one would have been cool if it were true. At the bottom was a hotline number for residents to report suspicious sightings. Spoiler: the hotline was Karen's personal cell. She watched from a distance, arms crossed, expecting someone to panic. I cleaned the mess and placed every flyer into a neat folder labeled evidence. Later that day, a drone buzzed above my backyard like a mechanical mosquito. I looked up and spotted Karen on her driveway, phone in hand, piloting it with the concentration of someone defusing a bomb. I waved. She flipped the drone higher and hovered over my bathroom window. That crossed a line. I called the sheriff. Again. Deputies showed up. Again. They approached Karen, who launched into a speech about security patrols and defending virtue. The deputy pointed out that flying a camera drone over someone's private windows violated about 3 different privacy laws. Karen tried to argue community oversight. The deputy wasn't impressed. He made her land the drone and warned her that next time, it would be confiscated. She sulked back toward her house like a villain dismissed mid-monologue. That evening, I received an email. It was short. Anonymous. It said, "She's planning something big tomorrow. Be ready." That was it. It felt like a warning from a spy movie. My cousin suggested sleeping with one eye open. Instead, I cleaned my porch, watered my plants, and waited. Because confrontation was inevitable, and I wanted to witness it fully conscious. Sunrise. I barely had time to sip coffee before I heard engines. Multiple. I stepped outside to find utility trucks lined up like a parade of bureaucratic doom. A water company team walked toward my meter. A gas inspector examined my street connection. Behind them, a city code enforcement officer. All holding clipboards. All directed to shut me down. Karen stood behind them, triumphant, arms folded, eyes glittering with victory she thought was guaranteed. She announced loudly that my home was being investigated for illegal habitation and that utilities were being suspended for the protection of the neighborhood. The utilities workers hesitated when I showed them my official accounts and permit. They backed off, confused. The enforcement officer asked who filed the complaint. Karen proudly raised her hand. He examined her paperwork and squinted. It wasn't paperwork. It was a stack of HOA printouts and handwritten notes declaring my house a hazard. He told her none of this constituted a legal basis. Karen scoffed, claiming authority through community support. The officer told her the county outranked neighborhood fantasies. Her triumphant smirk finally cracked. Then she did the unthinkable. She ran to my water meter and shoved a padlock through it. Yes. She tried to shut off my water herself. The code officer shouted at her to stop. She ignored him and began ranting at me about how I was forcing her to take drastic measures. I recorded the whole meltdown. The officer physically removed the lock, ordered her to step away, and demanded her ID. She refused. The man radioed for police support. Karen realized she had miscalculated. She screamed that she was being attacked for trying to save the neighborhood. The officer explained calmly that trespassing and unlawful interference with utilities were crimes. Real ones. Ones with punishment. When she couldn't convince them she was the victim, she pivoted. She pointed at my house and shouted that I was a threat to national security. Everyone blinked, stunned. One officer asked her to repeat that. She insisted my house might contain surveillance technology spying on residents. She claimed I was building a control center to take over the neighborhood. The gas worker snorted. The officer informed her she was spiraling into dangerous territory. Karen looked around and saw something she had never seen before. No one was backing her up. The spell was broken. The officers issued her a citation for trespassing and false reporting. A small consequence compared to what she deserved, but it was a start. They warned her that any further harassment would lead to arrest. Karen stared at me, betrayal and fury twinkling in her eyes. She whispered, "You turned them all against me." I told her she did that on her own. She yelled that I didn't understand destiny. I told her destiny doesn't issue citations. She had no comeback. The trucks left. Neighbors watched silently, trying not to look thrilled. The HOA board huddled together far away, clearly trying to rewrite their loyalty contract. I stood on my porch and exhaled for the first time in days. It felt like I had finally dug my way up from underwater. But peace didn't last. That night, motion alerts pinged my phone. An intruder on camera. I opened the feed. There she was, Karen, on my lawn, clutching a bucket, pouring something dark near my foundation. I zoomed in. She was dumping fertilizer and weed killer like she intended to ruin my landscaping out of spite. I called the sheriff once more. Officers arrived faster this time. They caught her leaving my yard. She screamed that I planted hazards to lure her. They didn't buy it. They placed her in handcuffs. Her board finally saw what she was truly capable of. She kept shouting threats about property values decreasing thanks to me. As the squad car drove away, the neighborhood released the breath it had been holding for years. People came out to talk, to thank me, to say they wished they'd stood up sooner. Their relief made me realize this wasn't just about me anymore. Karen wasn't fighting for the community. She was fighting to possess it. And she finally lost. Karen's arrest should have been the end. Anyone else would have taken the sheriff's warning, the citation, the humiliation, and retreated into quiet obscurity. But Karen wasn't anyone else. To her, consequences were merely delays, obstacles, minor inconveniences on the path to whatever fantasy monarchy she believed she ruled. The HOA board met the next morning without her for the first time in years. They sent a formal apology letter to me, complete with baked cookies from someone's terrified spouse. That alone told me Karen wasn't done. Because the apology didn't feel like resolution. It felt like a last meal before execution. By noon, rumors spread that Karen had hired a lawyer. A real one this time, not a Karen-grade DIY download from the internet. The board members were panicking, scrambling like chickens aware the fox had GPS. I received a message from the HOA secretary practically begging me to attend their emergency meeting so they could clarify they were not involved in any further aggression. They looked exhausted, defeated. I considered going, just for the spectacle, but something else demanded attention first. My property. Specifically, the mysterious dark patches Karen spilled the night she was arrested. My cousin tested the soil because paranoia beats regret. Good call. It was a potent mix. Fertilizer, herbicide, and some acidic additive. Not enough to cause structural harm, but enough to kill anything green for a year. She wanted my garden dead. She wanted to leave a mark, a wound she hoped I'd stare at daily. It almost impressed me. Malice with planning. Creativity in vengeance. But ultimately, it was just damage I'd repair. Roots grow back. Rage rots alone. That night, the whole neighborhood felt lighter. Kids rode scooters until late. Dogs barked without someone measuring the volume. A woman even hung wind chimes outside, tiny metal bells dancing in the breeze like freedom jingling. I sat on my porch, listening. Life had sound again. It made me realize how much Karen had drained from this place. The silence before was not peace, it was fear. Around sunset, a timid knock came at my door. It was Mrs. Benson again, clutching a box of cookies that smelled like a grandmother's patience. She looked around before speaking, as if expecting Karen to materialize from the shadows like a banshee of bylaws. Then she said something that twisted my stomach. Karen had a storage unit filled with files on every homeowner. Photos, recorded conversations, secret complaints, even copies of keys she'd forced residents to hand over in case of emergencies. She had built a literal vault of control. Mrs. Benson had learned this because one of the board members, newly liberated from Karen's tyrannical grip, confessed everything to her. She told me the storage unit was where Karen planned her operations. That was the exact word used. Operations. Like a military strategist, except her enemy was lawn decor. Mrs. Benson asked me if I planned to pursue charges. The county already had the incident report. My cousin said we had a solid harassment suit, possibly criminal. But I hesitated. I didn't want to become obsessed the way Karen was. I wanted to restore normalcy. Peace. But peace doesn't come without accountability. Karen had built her throne on intimidation. If she came back, and she would, she'd come back smarter. Quieter. So, I told my cousin to move forward. Enough was enough. The next day, I noticed something new. A realtor's sign. In Karen's yard. For a moment, I thought she'd quit and was fleeing to a new kingdom to terrorize. But the listing agent told a neighbor a different story. Karen didn't put her house up for sale. The HOA board did. They had used an obscure clause that allowed them to remove a president who endangered the community's stability. They were forcing her out. It was surreal. The dragon was being banished by her own knights. That night, the board chair and 2 members knocked on my door. They looked humbled. They apologized again for everything. They admitted fear had controlled them more than loyalty. They told me Karen was refusing to leave, threatening lawsuits, threatening to expose secrets gathered from her files. I asked why they kept her in power so long. The chair said, quietly, that it was easier to surrender than fight. I told him surrender always ends up costing more. As they left, one of them said something that stuck. You weren't the one she wanted to destroy. You were the one she couldn't control. The difference mattered more than I realized. Karen returned from jail just before midnight, furious and unstable. Security footage caught her pacing her driveway, shouting to no one, ripping down the realtor sign like it carried disease. At one point, she threw her shoe at my mailbox. If intimidation had a Yelp review system, that outburst would score 1 star. The next morning, I walked to check my mail and found Karen already waiting, standing in the street, shaky but defiant. Her hair was a storm cloud gone rogue. She said she had one question for me. Just one. Why couldn't you just follow the rules? She asked it with genuine confusion, as though the world would be perfect if everyone fell into formation behind her clipboard. I told her the simplest truth. Because freedom matters more than her approval. Because property lines exist. Because paint is not a crime. Because no neighbor earns the right to dictate another's life. She didn't like any of those answers. She said the neighborhood was hers to protect. I asked who it needed protection from: joy? Autonomy? Basic human rights? She accused me of destroying everything she'd built. I told her power built on fear collapses the moment someone refuses to bow. Her hands shook. She stepped closer. For a second, I truly thought she might hit me. Instead, she whispered that she would burn every rulebook she'd ever written before letting me win. She claimed this community needed her, and without her control, chaos would reign. I looked around. A father helping his son ride a bike. A couple planting flowers. A teenager skateboarding without fear of citations. I told her chaos looked beautiful. She stormed away. The sheriff stopped by later. They had enough incidents documented to issue a restraining order. He handed it to me with a sympathetic nod. Karen could no longer come within 50 feet of my property. Her face, when served, must have resembled a villain realizing the castle gates had locked from the outside. That night, I stood in my backyard staring at the stars, breathing air that finally felt mine. And that's when I heard it, a muffled thud near Karen's house, followed by shouting. Then sirens. Flashing lights. Deputies running. A stretcher. The night swallowed details, but the neighborhood woke up buzzing with shock. Karen had collapsed. Stress? Rage? Reality hitting too hard? She was taken to the hospital under psychiatric observation. Everyone whispered the same thought, but no one dared say it too loudly. The battle was over. Karen was gone. Or so we believed. What none of us realized was that Karen's exit would trigger the final twist. The explosively stupid final act she had set into motion weeks ago. The kind of move only she could justify in her own mind. A move already in motion. One that could bring down more than property values. The quiet was suspicious. Karen's absence felt like the pause between lightning and thunder, still, but vibrating with a storm waiting to crash. For the first time since moving in, I slept through the night. It almost felt normal. But morning arrived with a reminder that Karen's fingerprints were all over this community, even if she wasn't. A county notice awaited me in the mailbox. Follow-up inspection, hazard report. The vague wording felt like her doing. Bureaucracy moves slowly, and her complaints had ripples. I sighed, prepared the paperwork, and figured that would be the last remnant of her chaos. I was wrong. Around noon, homeowners emerged onto porches, staring at a black van rolling through the neighborhood. It had no company logos, no plates, and no driver visible through the tinted windows. The van moved slowly, pausing in front of every house like a predator selecting prey. When it reached mine, it stopped. The door slid open with a mechanical groan. Two men stepped out wearing matching blue jackets and carrying an enormous toolkit marked with one sharp word: enforcement. They marched straight toward my porch. I met them halfway. They announced they were contractors hired to enforce mandatory exterior compliance. Their instructions: repaint the house immediately with HOA-approved colors, remove unauthorized architectural deviations, and bill me afterward. They flashed a stack of documents stamped with something resembling an official seal. I didn't even need to read them. I recognized Karen's handwriting in the margin notes, furious loops and angry arrows pointing at my walls like they were national threats. I told the men the HOA had no jurisdiction here. They told me they had already been paid up front. Karen must have arranged it before her meltdown. The long game indeed. They looked exhausted, just workers trying to follow orders before quitting time. But I couldn't let a legacy order of tyranny be carried out. I asked them politely to leave. They said they had to follow the job sheet. I showed them the restraining order. They didn't care. They weren't the problem. Karen was. Still, I called the sheriff. Again. As we waited, the whole street gathered to watch. The workers opened their toolkit and pulled out scrapers and primer like surgeons prepping for a procedure. I stepped between them and my wall. A crowd formed. Someone filmed. By the time the deputy arrived, the tension could have been cut with a paint stir stick. The deputy examined the paperwork and recognized the cursed signature. He asked when Karen paid them. They revealed the answer. 2 weeks ago. Before she lost control. Before she was publicly dethroned. Before anyone knew her empire was doomed. She had scheduled her revenge in advance. And the workers had been stuck with a contract nobody had cancelled. The deputy shut the attempt down with stern clarity. The workers packed up, relieved to escape HOA hell unpaid but unarrested. The van rolled away. The neighborhood sighed. Crisis averted. Almost. That's when a call came in for the deputy. His face shifted. He excused himself, stepped aside, and spoke in a low voice. The neighborhood tried to eavesdrop discreetly. When he returned, his expression was tightly controlled, but fear flickered like a shadow trying not to exist. He asked me one question. Did you know there's a storage unit rented under Karen's name, with your address listed as the secondary notice contact? I did not. He told me the unit had been flagged. They needed me to come with them. At the storage facility, an officer slid open the metal door. The smell of stale paper and chemical cleaner rolled out like a ghost. Inside were rows of filing cabinets, shelves of binders labeled with names I recognized, every family on our street. Surveillance photos. notes about visitors, copies of complaints, even sketches of house layouts drawn from windows she shouldn't have been near. A cardboard box sat at the center like an altar, marked with my address. Inside were documents she had forged, fake cease and desist letters, altered property map, even a counterfeit deed transfer form that would have attempted to add me under HOA authority. She had planned to legally consume my home like a python swallowing prey too confident to run. And deeper in the pile, hidden like a secret weapon, an envelope addressed to the U.S. Department of Housing, accusing me of running an illegal rental operation and anti-community activities. The absurdity was so perfectly Karen that laughter escaped me before I could stop it. The officers weren't laughing. This was evidence of a conspiracy. Harassment on a scale only a clipboard tyrant could conceive. They began boxing everything, treating it like contraband. Then someone found a USB drive taped under a shelf. Inside were videos from her drone. Not just me. Every home, every backyard, every window she could zoom into. That was the final nail. The county wasn't just considering charges now, they were guaranteeing them. Later, the sheriff updated the community. Karen wasn't coming home soon. She had been moved from medical observation to criminal custody pending evaluation. She would face a long list of charges. The neighborhood didn't cheer. They exhaled. Relief is quieter than celebration. Days passed. Sunshine returned. I finished my renovations without interference. The garden recovered. Neighbors dropped by, comfortable now, offering real friendship instead of whispered gossip. The wind chimes stayed, dancing freely. Kids chalked dragons onto the sidewalks without fear of HOA color violations. One evening, while repainting a window trim, I noticed movement across the street. Karen's house sat dark and empty, realtor sign still leaning awkwardly in the grass. A single curtain shifted. Probably just the air conditioner through a cracked window. I dismissed it. Until I saw her. Just once. A face in the darkness watching me. The silhouette unmistakable. Eyes burning like litigation threat. A pale hand gripping the curtain. A mouth forming words I couldn't hear but didn't need to. She wasn't gone. Not yet. The restraining order kept her away from my property, but not from the boundaries of her own obsession. She remained inside the house, refusing sale, refusing defeat. The HOA board was trapped in limbo. They couldn't evict her without legal clearance. She lived there as a ghost refusing to cross over. But a ghost with no power is just a person in the dark. The next day, her windows were covered with boards. She wasn't watching anymore. Maybe she saw how the neighborhood healed without her. Maybe that was punishment enough. Or maybe she was planning again in silence, though for the first time. Her plans no longer mattered. Weeks later, I sat on my porch under warm twilight. The house glowed with the exact shade of paint she hated most. Free choice. Free living. A neighbor walked by with their dog and waved without fear. I waved back. For fun, I placed a single lawn gnome near the walkway. The kind Karen once called visual pollution. It looked ridiculous. Perfectly ridiculous. Control had left the street. Community had returned. I raised a glass to the horizon, appreciating the peaceful absurdity of everything that happened. And in the quiet, I whispered a victory no one could ticket or fine. I am not in the HOA.